Naivakara. The last witch burning in Ireland took place in Clonmel in 1895, which is just over 130 years ago. Now, this is mainly to do with the superstition of locality, and I hope you watch the first video, which is an interview with researchers on it by the late great Gay Byrne of the Late Late Show on RT television. And then afterwards we'll continue on with the story itself. Gurmargaret.
He did the dirty on her, did he?
He killed her, yeah. He burnt her to death in her own house, and he got all her cousins and her father to help him out. She was 26 years old. She was a very beautiful young girl. She was a typical peasant housewife from that period. She helped finance the family through selling eggs, through making clothes, things like that. One day in 1895, right, she went to visit a cousin of hers to deliver some eggs. She had to wait around a few hours to deliver those eggs, and she got a bit of a cold. She went home and she took to her bed. A few days later, the doctor called and he said it was okay. She was a little bit emotionally disturbed. He was used to that. She had had a few mental problems years earlier. And then a few days later, the priest called and he said she was okay as well, same problem. Then a cousin of hers, Patrick Dunn, called to see her and he said, "Oh, she's too fine. It's not Bridget Cleary. It's somebody else. Bridget Cleary has been taken away and replaced by a fairy-changeling." Now, this set her husband, Michael Cleary, into motion. He got very, very upset, and he decided that he would exorcise the fairy-changeling from his beloved wife.
And they managed to hold her over a fire on several occasions, did they not? And they threw potions at her as well.
Heading up towards St. Patrick's Day, 1895, on one Friday, Michael got all the neighbours into the house, and he started questioning Bridget as to whether she was the real Bridget Cleary. He said,
I think it was at this time that he sent for a local herb doctor, a man who had the cures and who was well versed in fairy lore. And he came along. His name was Gainey, and as it happened subsequently, I think the family changed their name in the area. But he arrived along, and he prescribed all sorts of concoctions, which had to be taken orally and applied.
What kind of concoctions, Eamon?
There was one evil-smelling brew that was based in milk and using various herbs. Some of the herbs haven't been described in any of the texts we've found. And then there was some awful mixture of hen's excrement and urine and so on that was smeared over her naked body, and it was fairly horrendous stuff.
That was supposed to do wonders, was it?
And this was meant to drive away the demon also.
Sounds like it would cure anything, as a matter of fact, yeah. Well, is there any relevance in all of this today, either of you, both of you?
You have a young girl, pretty young girl, married, happily married to her husband. She's seemingly faultless. I mean, we don't think that she was a witch or a fairy-changeling. We think she had certain little mental problems or certain social problems, or perhaps she was a healer. And the people in her closed community decided that it was worse than that. And this still happens today. I mean, you had a case this year which outraged the country of a young man being kicked to death in Fairview Park because some other people decided that he was a homosexual. And I don't know whether he was or not. I don't particularly care. I don't care whether Bridget Cleary was a fairy-changling or not either. It has that relevance, and it has several other relevances as well.
Do you mean, Joe, that anybody who is slightly different is looked upon with suspicion? Is that it?
That is one layer, and there is an even more important layer of violence in Irish society, which we have had ample evidence of in the last few days, which is still with us. I mean, it would be convenient to say that since Victorian times things have improved, but I don't see any real evidence of that. And I feel that the Bridget Cleary story, partly because it's about an outsider, a woman who I can't tell what sort of an outsider she was, but there was something unusual about her. She was persecuted for that. I think it is relevant to us today.
Yes, Eamon, would either of you be into the psychic phenomena field? I mean, do you believe this kind of thing?
Well, we've both read widely on the subject.
Indeed you have.
I think most of us, I think everybody at home and in the audience, are aware of a sixth sense or a premonition of somebody going to ring up and the phone rings, or meet a friend that they haven't seen for some time and walk around the corner and lo and behold somebody's there. As an extension of that, we sort of started to investigate, and we'd stumbled. Well, the Bridget Cleary story I think is fairly widely known, but I think it's the folklore account that's widely known. And it was only when Joe and I got chatting about it about a year ago that we realised In fact, there was much more to it. There was an awful lot left unsaid in the popular account. And it was then that we started to do some research. And as we did so, we began to realise that it was an incredibly gruesome story. It wasn't a fairy story, as we had originally believed, because there is a child skipping song still in the area.
About Bridget Cleary.
About Bridget Cleary.
Really?
Are you a witch? Are you a fairy? Or are you the wife of Bridget Cleary?
Yeah.
And it was people had accepted it on that level, and it was almost like a fun fairy story. But it was only when we started to delve into it that we began to realise that there were very powerful emotions at work here.
Did either of you find out what happened to him, the husband, Michael Cleary? Did he serve his sentence?
He
Did
went to jail for 20 years in Clonmel. And
Interestingly enough, I think for manslaughter, not actually for
for
murder.
manslaughter.
because, naturally enough, he didn't think he had killed his wife. He thought he'd got rid of a fairy.
Right.
And immediately after the death, he was full of guilt. And his father and her father was full of guilt. And they realised that they had killed the person who had kept their family going through
But
thick and thin.
did he do the 20 years,
He
Joe?
did do the 20
and
years.
then what?
But by that time, there had been a war of independence, a civil war. All the records had been burnt. And I really don't know all that much about it. It is Bridget we're concerned about, but I don't know that much
But you'd
about
love
that.
to know what happened to him. Did he ever come out? Did he get married again? Did he have children?
I would love to know what relationship he had with his community. I know that the father of Bridget Cleary, Patrick Boland, got out of jail shortly after his jail sentence started and returned to live in the community. And I don't think any great sort of sense of crime attached to the people.
Yes.
Because, they were part of a shared folk tradition.
Of course, and I suppose it was a brutal time and a brutal place.
It was. Tipperary at that time, I've looked up the statistics. I come from Tipperary, so I say this as a neutral person. It was the most violent county in Ireland. There were more outrages of an agrarian, political and social nature in that county than any other part of the country. And when I was going through the newspaper files looking up Bridget, I kept coming across cases of assault, which I mistook for the story I was looking for. And I kept coming across cases of husbands attacking their wives, and indeed vice versa.
And indeed vice versa.
Indeed.
Get that bit in. Make sure. Yes, it happens both ways. Do you think that people still believe in these old pishogues about changelings and fairies and
I
things?
think the changeling in particular is a very common belief. When I was inside in a cafe in the city centre telling somebody about this story, and I was interrupted by two working class women from Dublin who told me that there was a lad living down in the Liberties who had been taken up. He was a changeling. He was a fairy. His mother had brought him to the Phoenix Park in 1902, and she went away for a minute. I don't know what she went away to do. She left him in the pram, and when she came back, she had a fairy changeling. But I was told that he was okay, he was a nice lad, and that he wasn't simple or anything, and that he was just accepted as a fairy changeling today in Dublin. Yeah. And I'm sure, I don't know what the audience thinks, but I know that throughout the country there are stories of fairy changelings who are indeed still alive.
Yeah. We've no changelings in the audience tonight. A few of them look
They won't admit to it anyway.
No, of course
Nobody
not.
wants to be burnt to death.
It was the last witch burning in Europe, wasn't it?
Well, it became known as the last witch burning in Europe. We think erroneously because the phrase witch was being used and bandied around in court, and of course the press picked up on it.
Bridget Cleary was born and died in the then relatively remote Ballyvadlea near Clonmel, South Tipperary. She was only 26 years old when the time of her death in 1896, and according to the Cork Examiner, she had been a pretty woman of medium height and of strong independent cast of mind. Her parents, Patrick and Bridget Boland, belonged to the poor Catholic rural labouring classes. They were devoutly religious and extremely superstitious. This is not surprising considering the area in which they lived. Ballyvadlea was steeped in folklore and tradition. All through the area, the remnants of ancient earthen forts and tumulti hinted at the lore and secrets of former peoples, while from the road which ran through the district, the traveller could see the distant slopes of Slievenamon, or the fairy-haunted mountain, which was once the stronghold of the legendary Fianna, where all manner of supernatural creatures were said to dwell. Between the slower slopes and Fathar town, many Schleveens lived. These were the fairy doctors, or cunning men, who were intimately familiar with the ways of the little people, and who displayed skills that verged on the supernatural. These were men like Dennis Gainey, who resided in a reputedly well-appointed thatched cabin in Kitely in the mountainside, or John / Jack Dunn, a limping, toothless man who tramped the streets of both Clonmel and Fathar, telling tales of both fairies and ghosts. These were fairy-haunted sites everywhere in the locality. At certain times of year, Slievenamon itself was reputedly frequented by witches and enchanters from all over Ireland. Close to the Bolands lived rose the brooding bulk of Kennagarna Hill, which was topped by a fairy fort or rath, reputedly a Shehoga place, where the She or the fairy host held court and plotted mischief against the humans who lived around them. Local people simply avoided the place. Beliefs connecting such beliefs to sites and supernatural dangers ran very deep amongst them. Although a strong-willed and opinionated young woman, Bridget Boland did not appear to have felt the need to move away from her narrow rural environment. Always good at sewing and stitching, she became a self-employed dressmaker working from home. Indeed, as her father was free to state later, she became the first woman in Ballyvadlea to own a new Singer sewing machine which she kept in her bedroom. Her new business venture seems to have been popular throughout the local community, and soon Bridget Boland was relatively prosperous, which added to her desirability amongst the young men in surrounding townsland of Ballyvadlea, Clonmel and Mullinahone. She could have had her pick of any of them. A stylish young woman by all accounts, it appeared that she was noticed by some of the local landowners who, on his way to hunting with the Tipperary hounds, had been so struck by attractiveness as she passed him on the road that he had asked her who she was, and later claimed the memory of her stayed with him into the old age. Her prettiness had also turned the heads of many of the young labourers in the area. However, the man she chose as her husband came as a surprise to the entire community. He was Michael Cleary, a dark brooding character almost 10 years older than herself. It is thought that Bridget and Michael met in Clonmel town. She was doing some apprentice work in a milliner's there. He was working as a cooper, or a barrel maker. He was a dark and sullen man who reputedly had never bothered much with women and was highly superstitious. He was, for example, aware of his wife's mother, Bridget Keating, who had been considered to be a fairy woman, who had been taken several times, and who as a result had been somewhat distrusted. He was an unlikely partner for the independent Bridget Boland. Even so, they were married in August 1887, when Bridget was 18 and Michael was 27. It was an unusually young age for Bridget, as most Irish women of the time delayed getting wed until they were around 26. In fact, there was a surplus of unmarried women across Ireland. The marriage was even more strange because for some time after the wedding, Michael continued to live and work in Clonmel, while Bridget returned home every evening to her parents' house near Ballyvadlea Bridge. The reason for this may have been that Bridget had to be at home looking after her mother who was ill. But there were also other rumours too. Some people in the area suggested Bridget might have been seeing someone else, and the general consensus was that one of her neighbours, William Simpson. If such an affair existed, and there was absolutely no evidence that it did, there were good reasons for keeping it quiet. Simpson was married and lived with his wife Mary and 2 children in a farmhouse a few hundred yards from the Clearys. He is described as an emergency man, or a former land steward, and as such was not the sort of man you could easily make friends with. He and his family occupied a farm from which the landlord, his employer, had evicted the previous tenants some years before. But there was something else. The Simpsons were Protestants, and in conservatively Catholic area the idea of a young Catholic girl consorting with a married Protestant was scandalous, if not unthinkable. There was probably no truth in the rumours at all, but it fitted in well with somewhat local people considered to be Bridget's high and mighty attitude. If the stories about his wife ever reached Michael Cleary in Clonmel, he appeared to take no heed of them. A little while after Bridget's marriage, the Cashel Poor Law Guardians erected a new cottage in the district under the 1883 Labourers Act. This was designed to be suitable for a labouring family and was built a half mile up from the hill from Ballyvadlea Bridge in the townland of Tullochosson. From the door and front window, it had a direct view across the countryside to distant Slievenamon. It was a fine modern structure with a high sloping slated roof and a chimney at each gable, and as such was considered much grander than the cabins roundabout. There was one drawback, however. It had been built on the site of an old fairy rath, and the immediate area was widely regarded as a supernatural site. Such a reputation deterred many locals from applying for its tenancy. Nevertheless, in the late 1880s, Bridget and Michael Cleary, supported by Bridget's parents, applied to the Guardians for tenancy of the new cottage. They were unsuccessful, and the place was given to another labourer. Shortly after he moved in, the place fell vacant again, allegedly due to certain problems. It was unclear what these problems might be, but it was said that the fairies had taken exception to the occupancy and had disturbed the man with unearthly cries and shrieks. He quickly moved out. Once again, the Clearys applied for tenancy to the cottage, and this time they were successful. It is unknown whether they took up occupancy, but it is suspected that the move created some local resentment. After all, compared to many of their neighbours, the couple was regarded reasonably well off. And furthermore, Bridget was thought to have airs about her. The new cottage reflected their supposed grand The new college reflected their supposed to be grand status in relation to their neighbours. Despite Bridget Ayres, the family soon fell into arrears of rent, not uncommon in the district. But posting given the Cleary's relative prosperous status. In fact, they were so badly in arrears that the poor law guardians forbade any repair work to be carried out on the cottage until the debt was cleared. At Tullochosson, they were surrounded by relatives. Mary Kennedy, Patrick Boland's widowed sister, and Bridget's aunt lived a short distance away at Ballyvadlea Bridge. Her sons, Patrick, James, and William, all labouring men, lived with her, as did her 11-year-old granddaughter, Katie Burke, who was her daughter Joanna's eldest child. Joanna herself lived nearby with her husband, Michael Burke, also a labourer, and several other children. Bridget had been Joanna's bridesmaid, and the two women were reasonably close, despite Joanna being some years older than her cousin. Joanna Burke was known as Hanny to her family and friends. From the time she came to live in Tullochosson, Bridget continued to show a strong independent spirit. Michael was still working in Clonmel, and it was up to her to run the house and provide for her widowed father after her mother's death. She still did some dressmaking, although not as much as before, and she now had another source of income. She kept hens. Hens and their eggs were an important source of income to any household, and it enabled Bridget to be more or less financially independent from her husband and set a tidy sum of money by for herself. She sold on tick, collecting the money from her produce around the start of each month. But there were some problems with this arrangement, however, as not everyone was willing or able to pay her when she called, and some of her neighbours had soon run up some large bills. The winter of 1894/95 was particularly cold and severe, all through South Tipperary. Snow and ice, coupled with hard frost, delayed farm work long after Christmas, and many labourers found themselves without wages and facing the prospect of serious debt and destitution. It was not until late March that the weather picked up again and working conditions improved. For the Cleary, situation was not so desperate, not being a labourer. Michael was not independent on seasonal work like his neighbours. But for Bridget, the impact was slightly more serious. If money was scarce throughout the countryside, payment for eggs already sold would be hard to come by. On Monday, the 4th of March 1895, Bridget Cleary walked from her home in Tullochosson across Ballyvadlea Bridge towards a squalid cabin near Glengranagh Hill. It was there that the ferryman, Jack Dunn, lived with his wife Kate, and Bridget was calling him to collect outstanding money for eggs. Winter still had a firm grip on the land, and although the day was dry, it was very cold. The weather had settled into a very awkward pattern, bitter days filled with snow and sleet, followed by 3 or more milder ones with wind and rain. The country people said that it wasn't a healthy time. It had been snowing the night before, and as she walked, Bridget could see the peak of distant Sleafamon was white in the morning sun. Dunn's dwelling was a rough, narrow roadside hut, and as she drew nearer, it appeared to be empty. Jack and Katie Dunn had no children and spent most of the time in the pubs of Clonmel or Fethard, leaving their cabin empty for long periods. Bridget knocked on the door, but there was no reply. She waited for a while, feeling cold penetrating her clothes, then walked home again and entered her own house shivering. She tried to warm herself in front of the open fire, but according to her cousin Joanna Burke, it was no use. She had caught what the country people called a founder, which is called a severe and penetrating chill. The shivering fit hadn't passed even by the next day, and Bridget now complained of severe headache. Great attention was paid to the place where she had received the founder and her reasons for being there. Living near the sinister Glengranagh Hill, Jack Dunn said it was to be well in with the fairies and was widely regarded as a shanachie or a teller of stories, and a custodian of ancient lore. He claimed to have seen the fairies on numerous occasions playing hurling near his back door on the last night of the light of the evening. In the pubs he frequently complained of an awful pain in his back, which he had said occurred one night when the fairies had lifted him bodily out of his bed and thrown him out into the yard. A couple of times he had been chased into his house by a man in black and a woman in white, who were undoubtedly of the fairy kind. He claimed to know the fairies intimately and had been up to Glengranagh Hill with them. Such talk often secured drinks for him and his wife, and he was treated with a great deal of awe and respect. To demand money from a man who was so friendly with the fairies might be to invite disaster. Maybe that's what Bridget Cleary's founder was all about. Bridget went to bed to see if she could recover from the chill she had caught at Jack Dunn's door. There was no sign of improvement, and if anything, her conditions grew slowly worse. It's possible she may have caught pneumonia, but she remained untreated. Doctors in the country areas around Clonmel were fewer and far between, and were very expensive. Far better to fetch the fairy doctor than see if he could cure the chill, so as that Jack Dunn himself made his way to Tullochosson. Ostensibly he came as a relative and neighbour to see how she was, but as a man connected to the fairies he was probably also called upon to make an unofficial diagnosis to see what might be wrong with her and how best she might be cured. Although able to sit at the fire and take some food and walk around a little, Bridget was still feverish and was certainly not her former confident, attractive, well-turned-out self. Dunn sat with her for a little while, but the room was probably dark and his eyesight was not keen. Squinting in the smoky light, the old man looked at the young woman. His words were to have a dramatic effect on subsequent events. "That is not Bridget Boland," he whispered, using her maiden name. In this other circumstance, such a remark might not be taken differently. Jack Dunn could easily have said, "She's not looking like herself today," or "She's badly failed." But coming from the lips of a ferryman, these words have a particular resonance. Jack Dunn was actually articulating what a number of people were actually thinking anyway, that the real Bridget had somehow been spirited away and had been replaced by a stock, or a pattern of herself. This was no longer a human woman, but a shiogi thing that had come down from Killingragh Hill to take her place. Bridget, of course, had a number of enemies amongst her neighbours, those who were envious for her, suitors that she snubbed, and those who thought she was too high and mighty, and some have been remarking how a proud and independent woman had suddenly turned into a weak and insipid invalid who could not even get out of the house. The reason for such a sudden and rapid deterioration had to be a supernatural one. There was one other indication that this might be the case. Although they had been married for over 7 years, Michael and Bridget Cleary were still childless, a sure hint of fairy involvement. Following Dunn's assertions, he was asked to look at the invalid more closely, and he immediately suggested that she was indeed a fairy. One leg, he stated, was longer than the other, which is a condition which was not dissimilar to his own, which was a sure sign that she was fairy-struck. While he was measuring Bridget, Michael Cleary arrived in the house to find him there. He paid close attention to everything Jack Dunn had to say, taking the old man's opinion to heart. "This is not my wife at all, this is not Bridget," Michael muttered to himself. "This is a fairy creature from Killingragh Hill." But although he was suspicious, he did nothing about it. Bridget's condition worsened over the next few days. By Saturday, the 9th of March, she was barely able to stir herself from her bed. Her cousin Joanna Burke believed that she had caught a fresh chill, or that the founder had gotten a real hold on her. Despite the consultation with Jack Dunn, it was considered that a trained medical doctor should be sent for. Patrick Boland walked 4 miles to Fethard to ask Dr. William Crean to call to the house and look at his daughter. On his journey to the doctor's surgery, he stopped at the house of one of the poor law guardians and to get the red ticket which entitled Bridget to medical examination under the poor law scheme. He then walked to the spinnery on Fethard to ask Crean to visit the house. The weekend passed and the doctor had still not come. The weather was changing, gales were blowing and days were dull and wet. The road to Ballyvadlea was muddy and covered with blown down branches and leaves. Perhaps Crean didn't fancy travelling into that remote area on what it might be considered as a charity case. Perhaps he was busy elsewhere. There were also stories that the good doctor was a bit too fond of the bottle for his own good, and that he attended his medical duties in haphazard fashion. From late Sunday all through Monday it rained very heavily, nearly flooding the roads. But as the evening wore on, it began to ease. There was still no sign of Dr. Crean, but all the while Bridget's condition appeared to grow steadily worse. Joanna Burke was convinced now that she had a fever, and that doctor must be brought as a matter of urgency. On Monday afternoon, Michael Cleary himself walked all the way to Fethard to remind the doctor, but Crean still didn't come, nor did he come on Tuesday. On Wednesday, 13th March, Michael Cleary again walked 4 miles to Fethard to see if the doctor would come, and he also sent a message to Drangan Chap to ask Father Cornelius Ryan if he would come to attend his wife who was dying. This did the trick. On Wednesday afternoon, Dr. Crean finally came to Cleary House. His examination may have been a cursory one, but swift diagnosis and perfunctory Bridget was suffering from nervous excitement, coupled with slight bronchitis. He was prescribed medicine and went back to Fethard. Later, at Michael Cleary's trial, he would reveal that he didn't know if the family had actually obtained the medicine, nor could he give any cause for the excitement. But he would reveal that Bridget had been attending a surgery in Fethard for about 6 to 8 months, although he didn't say why. The popular belief is that she had a tubercular condition and she'd been attending the TB clinic in Clonmel. Bridget's illness was now beginning to have impact on the immediate family. Michael Cleary was sinking deeper and deeper into depression, and Patrick Boland was becoming increasingly worried about his daughter's condition. He asked his sister, Mary Kennedy, to call on her, and she said that she'd bring Johanna Burke, who lived nearby at Rackini. When Han Burke arrived, both she and Bridget got into earnest conversation, and Joanna was of the opinion that there was some sort of marital difficulty between Bridget and her husband, but this remained unspecified. "He's making a fairy of me," complained the invalid. In local parlance, this meant that Michael Cleary was distancing himself from her for some reason. Joanna Burke also knew that Michael Cleary had frequent disagreements with his mother-in-law, and who he thought was a fairy woman, had passed on some of her rumoured arcane power and skills to her daughter, making the brooding superstition man nervous of his wife. Even with the visitors, the almost forced merriment going on in the house, Bridget's condition didn't improve. If she was taking Dr. Crean's medicine, it had no apparent effect on her. As he looked from his doorway to distance them on, Michael Cleary wondered if he should do about his wife. He tried to bring Dr. Crean to the house no less than 3 times. When he finally did come, his diagnosis had been unsatisfactory. There was another option, of course. Jack Dunn had suggested the family consult with Dennis Gainey, a ferryman over in Cattley in the lower slopes of the mountain. And so on Thursday the 14th of March, Michael Cleary set off for Slievenamon. According to contemporary accounts, Dennis Gainey was a middle-aged man, rather tall with a heavy beard. Like Jack Dunn and several other ferrymen, he walked with a limp, having one leg shorter than the other. According to Michael Cleary, Gainey listened very attentively, asking several questions about Bridget's condition, and then handed over something with 9 herbs in it, which he claimed would drive the fairy out of Michael's wife. The meeting with Gainey had a powerful effect on Cleary, and he returned home in highly agitated state. It is reasonable to suppose a cure he had obtained from Gainey over the mountain probably contained lushmore, or foxglove, which is supposed to burn the entrails out of any fairy or unearthly creature. It had to be mixed with the bee stings of the first drawn milk from a cow directly after calving into a bucket in which a silver coin had been placed. If the charm contained a substantial amount of foxglove, then it was poisonous, and would have worsened Bridget's condition. But Michael Cleary, who apparently believed in charms and fairy potions, was determined that she should have it. After the meeting with Dennis Gainey, he was now more convinced than ever that Bridget was a changeling, and that, if not dealt with, she would work a malign influence on him and his family. Perhaps it was Gainey who had put the notion in his head, but now he's convinced that the real Bridget had been abducted by the fairy kind and was now being held prisoner somewhere beneath Clonmel Hill, having been replaced with something awful, supernatural thing that needs to be driven out. The same evening, a crowd of neighbours, including the Burkes and the Simpsons, called at the Cleary house to see how Bridget was. As they approached the building, they heard a man's voice from inside shout angrily, "Take that, you rap." Pausing outside the place, a couple of them tried to look in through the window, but the shutters were drawn and he could see nothing. They knocked on the door, but from inside, Michael Cleary's voice told them that they couldn't come in yet. For some minutes, the neighbours waited outside the door whilst voices inside the house screamed and shouted. They heard snatches of a heated conversation. "Take that, you old bitch," or "Take it, you witch." Then, to everyone's surprise, the door flung open, and from there, inside, a man's voice cried, "Away she go, away she go." Michael Cleary came to the doorway, apparently bathed in sweat, and invited his neighbours in. They looked at him strangely, and he explained that he kept the door closed because the house had been full of fairies. One of the first through the door was Johanna Burke, and she was to say later the scene greeted them as one of brutal horror. Patrick Boland was sitting in the kitchen table by the light of a large oil lamp, and everyone else was at the bedroom. Bridget Cleary was lying in the bed with Jack Dunn, forcibly holding her head down by the ears. Her cousin Patrick Kennedy was on the far side of the bed, gripping her right arm, while his brother James held her left. The younger brother William lay across her legs to prevent her from moving them and from trying to get up. They were forcing her to take something on a spoon from a small black saucepan, which Jack Dunn called a pint. Later, a report in the Irish Times covering Michael Cleary's trial stated, quote, "Cleary was given her medicine, some herbs in a spoon. Bridget Cleary was trying not to take it. She said it was too bitter. When Cleary put the milk into the mouth, he put his hand in her mouth to prevent the medicine from coming up. He said that if it went on the ground, then she could not be brought back from the fairies." Cleary asked her, was she Bridget Cleary or Bridget Boland, wife of Michael Cleary in the name of God? He asked her more than once. She answered 3 times before he was satisfied. End quote. It seems that Michael Cleary succeeded in forcing at least some of the herbal mixture down his wife's throat. In fact, he managed about 3 doses of stuff while his neighbours were there, and is said to have made her swallow a further 3 times before they arrived. When this was done, all the men who were present shouted, "Away with you, come home Bridget Boland in the name of God." Then they clapped their hands and slapped her. However, one of the neighbours who had come in paid close attention to a great burn marks across the invalid's forehead, and was later discovered that she had been threatened with a red-hot poker in order to make her take the herbs. Hearing the voices of the visitors in the kitchen, Bridget screamed loudly. Then Michael Cleary asked his wife again, "Are you Bridget Boland, wife of Michael Cleary in the name of God?" Bridget seemed to make no answer, or else her reply was so weak and faint that nobody in the room could actually hear it. Turning to her husband, Jack Dunn said, "Make a good fire and we'll make her answer." The fire had already been burning quite well in the open hearth, and although no fuel had been added to it, gathered round the men lifted Bridget bodily from the bed, winding her in bedclothes and carrying her to the grate. Jack Dunn took her head and James Kennedy her feet. Michael Cleary opened, following the spoon and saucepan. According to Joanna Burke, Bridget seemed to be fully conscious and well aware of what was going on. With little effort, the men held her over the steadily burning flames. With desperation etching in his voice, Patrick Boland said, "Are you the daughter of Patrick Boland, the wife of Michael Cleary?" Bridget, clearly terrified, struggled a little. "I am, Dada," she answered clearly. The men continued to hold her over the flames for at least 10 minutes before carrying her back to bed. After subjecting her to this ordeal by fire, it might have been that they felt temporarily convinced that they had driven out the witch-like creature. At about 7 a.m. on Friday the 15th March, Father Cornelius Ryan was called from the parochial house in Dragon to visit Bridget. The priest had actually called on her 2 days before as requested, but was told that she was dying. He had given her the last rites of the church, but he refused to come when called upon that Thursday. Now Michael Cleary turned up at his door once more and asked him to come. Somewhat reluctant, Father Ryan did so. He arrived at the house sometime after 8 a.m., said Mass in Bridget's bedroom, and gave her Holy Communion. Bridget, however, was reputed not to have swallowed the sacred host, but to have surreptitiously removed it from her mouth with her fingers, something expressly forbidden by Catholic teaching. If this indeed happened, the action may have sealed her fate, because it is well known that neither witch nor fairy could bear the touch of the blessed host on their tongue. As well as that, both witches and evildoers often use the wafer in the preparation of pishogues, or in dark magics. Whether this was communicated to Michael Cleary isn't known, but if it was, it would undoubtedly strengthen his belief about his wife. Father Ryan asked him if he was still giving her the medicine that Dr. Crean had prescribed her, but Cleary said that he had no faith in it. The priest seemed to concur, as he spoke of William Crean as being always drunk. During the afternoon, an argument of some kind appeared to have developed between Joanna Burke and Michael Cleary about a payment for the milk which the former alleged she had sold to Bridget. According to the evidence given later by Joanna Burke, Mrs. Cleary asked her husband if I was paid for the milk. I said yes, and I showed her the shilling, which she took and put under her blankets and gave back up again in a minute. This incident seemed to have later have the source of some trouble between husband and wife, for Michael Cleary withheld milk from Bridget when she asked for it later in the day. It seems that he later accused his wife of having rubbing a shilling on her leg when he had put it under the blankets, and interpreted this as a sinister action in her part, as if she was making a spell or a pishogue. The incident also highlights Joanna Burke's possibly ambivalent attitude towards her cousin, of which she may have disapproved or been jealous. That evening, some neighbours called to see how Bridget was progressing. In tight-knit country communities, this was to be taken as good neighbourliness, but they may have been motivated to come by curiosity as well. They sat in the kitchen, and later Joanna Burke joined them, making some porridge. Because they were visitors, Cleary got his bed out of wife, had her dressed, and brought her amongst the company. One of the visitors, Tom Smith, asked how she was keeping, and she replied that she was middling, but her husband was making a fairy of her. She referred to the fact that her husband would not allow her to drink any of the milk that Johanna had brought, and that she had never asked for milk without buying it. Later that night, Joanna Burke's brothers, Bridget's cousins, Patrick, James and William, arrived back from Michael Cleary's father's wake, which had been held in Killinleague, 8 miles away. Michael Cleary's father had died the day before, but his son had not attended the wake, owing apparently to his wife's illness. Towards midnight, some of the neighbours left, and it was now the immediate members of the family that were left. Bridget and her husband, her father Patrick Boland, her aunt Mary Kennedy, her cousins, and her cousin Joanna's young daughter Katie. As Bridget was being handed a cup of tea, Michael Cleary got 3 pieces of bread and jam and insisted she eat them before she drank the tea. He suddenly asked, "Are you Bridget Cleary, my wife, in the name of God?" He asked this 3 times, and she answered him twice, and ate 2 pieces of bread and jam. When she didn't answer the 3rd time, he rose from where he had been sitting and forced the 3rd piece of bread and jam down her throat, shouting, "Swallow it, is it down, is it down?" He then struck her across the face, flinging her from a seat onto the earthen floor of the cottage. Desperately, Bridget called her cousin to intervene. "Oh, Han," but Mrs. Burke did nothing. Perhaps she was frightened of the violent Michael Cleary, who now, in a fit of even greater rage, tore off most of his wife's clothing, leaving her in her chemise in front of the men. Taking a burning stick from the grate, he brandished it in front of her face, as if trying to ram it down her throat. Then, taking the house key, he crossed the door, turned the lock, effectively locking everyone inside the cottage. At this point, clearly terrified by his demented behaviour, Mrs. Burke withdrew into the bedroom. Her role in the events and failure to come to her cousin's aid when she was in mortal danger seems unclear. Perhaps she felt unable to intervene between husband and wife because local propriety forbade that. A few of the others remained. Johanna's mother, Mrs. Kennedy, for instance, had also earlier gone into the bedroom for a bit of a doze. Johanna heard Bridget shout, "Give me a chance," and she heard her head strike the floor and heard a scream. The kitchen must have been a scene of total chaos. Michael Cleary was now apparently standing over his wife with a still burning stick, jerking at her and threatening her. He jerked close to her body, and only took a minute for the cloudless chemise to catch fire. In the bedroom beyond, Mary Kennedy was hardly more than dozing when she heard her son William cry from the kitchen, "Mother, mother, Bridgie is burned." She rose up, and both she and Joanna burst out, "What ails he?" Michael Cleary came to the bedroom door, and with a solemn face turned to Mrs. Burke. "I believe she's dead." And in walking over to the window, he took down a lamp, and unscrewing the cap, poured paraffin all over the prone body and the floor. There was no doubt that he was now out of control, and he attempted to set fire to Bridget. He was stopped by Mrs. Kennedy, whom he pushed away. "What are you doing with the creature?" cried the old woman, as she reeled back. "Is it roasting her you are?" Michael Cleary suddenly darted forward and set fire to his wife's paraffin-soaked body, which was ablaze in an instant. The recklessness of this act was underlined by the fact that he could easily have set the whole house on fire and all of its occupants. For the love of God, Michael, James Kennedy, who had risen from Patrick Boland's bed, where he had been sleeping, came to the bedroom door and witnessed the horror. "Don't burn your wife." Half turning, Cleary turned to him blankly. "She's not my wife," he answered in a low, flat voice. "She's an old deceiver sent in place of my wife. She's been deceiving me for the last 7 or 8 days, and deceived the priest too, but she won't deceive me any more. As I begin with her, I'll finish it with her. You'll soon see her go up the chimney." By this he referred to the traditional escape route for a changeling. Seeing that the man's wits were clearly gone, William Kennedy, who had come down to Cleary House with his mother, asked him for the house key so that they might go, but Cleary only drew a knife and told him that the door won't be opened again until real Bridget had been returned to him from her imprisonment under a Clonmel hill. Waving the weapon at William, he was threatened to run him through if he attempted to leave. The boy fainted clean away. Turning to the rest of the family, Cleary warned them, "If you come out any more, I'll roast you as well as her." Everyone withdrew into the bedroom, leaving Cleary alone with his burning wife. Still holding the lamp, he threw oil on her 3 times, before sitting down in a chair to watch the flames rise. Some of the others peeped out of the bedroom, and Cleary turned towards them, shouting, "You're a dirty set. You'd rather have her with the fairies in Clonmel than have her here with me." Patrick Boland came out of the room and informed Cleary if there was anything he could do to save his daughter, then he would do it. Cleary answered him that he could bury her with her mother, who had also been of the fairy. He further told him that next Sunday that he, Cleary, would go to Clonmel hill, where the Will Bridget would come riding to him on a white horse, and that he would cut the golden straps that bound her to the animal. She would be free and be his once more. This apparently is what Gainey over the mountain had told him, although he would later declare that Bridget had told him it herself. As he spoke, Joanna Burke later in the court, the house filled with smoke and flames crackled around Bridget's body. Later, under duress, Patrick Kennedy went with Michael Cleary to bury the body at a secret spot nearby. The rest of the family remained locked in the house by Cleary. Once the body had been buried, Cleary made it all to witness the atrocity, kneel down and swear on the holy name not to reveal it to a soul. He would subsequently tell those who asked Bridget had simply gone away. The next day, Sunday, 16th March, Jack Dunn, badly agitated, accompanied Michael Cleary and Michael Kennedy to Drangan village to attend confession in the chapel there. Although Father Byrne was the parish priest, he seems to be largely sympathetic towards Michael Cleary, on the surface at least, but as a curate, Father McGrath, who took confession that day. John Dunn went to the box first and spoke quietly to the curate, who told him to send Michael Cleary in to see him. Cleary came in weeping and spoke to Father McGrath. Although what was said remains under the sealed confessional, the curate, however, was deemed that he was in no fit state to receive absolution. He went to fetch Father Ryan, and the 3 of them talked for a long time. All the while Michael Kennedy remained outside in the chapel yard. Eventually, Father Ryan emerged and walked straight across the road into Drangan Police Barracks. Again, no one knows what was said by the parish priest to Acting Sergeant Patrick Egan inside the barracks, but it was enough to arouse police suspicions. Egan was well known in the locality, and he had probably heard the weird stories that were circling about Michael Cleary and the mysterious appearance of his wife. However, he couldn't investigate without formal complaints being lodged, especially in a tight-knit rural community like Ballyvadlea. Taking another policeman with him, Egan followed Michael Cleary along to the Fethard Road, and he stopped at Mary Kennedy's cottage. The policeman, approaching him, asked him about his wife. Sticking to his original story, Cleary informed him that she had left home about 12 o'clock last night, and he hadn't actually seen her go, as he had been in bed at the time asleep. Egan walked home with him, repeating his questions from time to time. Cleary always answered Bridget was gone, and he didn't know where. As he left the house, Egan heard a distressed Patrick Boland shout from his side, "My daughter will come back to me." The old man would insist right up to his trial his daughter was alive and well and living elsewhere, with the fairies. Despite Michael Cleary's assurances, Egan was suspicious and asked for more police from Clonmel to be drafted to Ballyvadlea. Their mission was to look for Bridget. Shortly after these men arrived, there was a formal complaint made against Michael Cleary. The name of the complaint was never disclosed, but it seemed to be William Simpson, long reputed to be Bridget Cleary's lover. Simpson was to claim that Michael Cleary had approached him for a loan or a revolver, so that he could go up to Clonmel fort and bring back his wife. Simpson didn't lend him the gun, but he later claimed to have seen Cleary going up carrying a large table knife. Allegedly, Cleary waited there for a long time for Bridget to appear on a white horse, but he had seen nothing. By now the situation had become too serious and too complex for the Drangan police station to handle, and Patrick Egan passed the case to Inspector Joseph Wansborough on Carrigan Shore, who ordered a full-scale search of the area around Cleary's cottage. Police were soon searching the areas of Drangan, Clonmel and Monaghan. Wansborough visited a number of homes around Ballyvadlea and took copious notes from those he interviewed. He soon obtained his first formal sworn statement. It came from William Simpson and was given on Monday the 18th of March before W. Walker Tennant, Justice for the Peace. Simpson stated that he witnessed Bridget Cleary being ill-treated in her home by the previous Thursday night. He also named at least some of the people whom he knew to have been there and who he considered responsible. Once again, police swarmed through the area and those who Simpson had named were questioned. Joanna Burke went separately to Justice Walker Tennant and swore some further information in front of him, in the effect that Bridget Cleary had left her home while sick and had disappeared. The Justice then asked Wansborough if charges be brought against anyone. Strangely, given they had now had so much concrete information regarding the case, the first person that Wansborough charged was the Slovene Dennis Gainey. He was charged with causing Bridget Cleary to be ill-treated and to great actual bodily harm done to her. This was bizarre since it was Gainey who had never even met Bridget Cleary, even though some of his influence on events had been profound. All the same, the police net was being tightened around Michael Cleary. On Friday, 22nd of March 1895, officers from the Royal Irish Constabulary, or the RIC, guided by William Simpson, searched the area of the boggy ground near the area of Tullochusson, near to the Cleary home. Away in a corner of a field about a quarter mile from the cottage, Sergeant Patrick Rogers of the Monaghan Constabulary noticed some freshly turned earth and crushed bushes. Constable Somers and O'Callaghan helped him dig down about 18 inches where they found a dirty sheet wrapped around what seemed to be a woman's body. The corpse itself had been pulled up into a crouching position with the knees almost against the chin, and the body was very badly burnt. It was naked except a few remnants of clothing, all badly charred, which had been seared to the skin, a pair of black stockings. The head had also covered in a sack and was largely untouched. There was still a gold earring in one of the ears. Tearing away the coarse sacking, Rogers looked in the face and identified it. They had found what remained of Bridget Cleary. Now that her body had been found, arrests followed swiftly. Police took a number of people from the Ballyvadlea and Tullochusson districts, including Michael Cleary, Patrick Boland, Bridget's father, Mary Kennedy, Joanna Burke, and the Kennedy brothers, and Jack Dunn. All across Ireland and far beyond, interest was suddenly focused on a remote area, County Tipperary, as the incident became widely known as the Clonmel witch burning. Soon, obscure Ballyvadlea was known halfway around the world as a place of dark superstition and sinister events. Indeed, elements of the British and Unionist press tried to make a political capital of the affair by proclaiming as evidence of the backwardness of the Irish peasantry and their unfitness for home rule. The defendants were arraigned at the summer assize in Clonmel and were brought to trial on 4th July 1895. The judge, Mr. Justice O'Brien, paid scant attention to talk of fairies and witchcraft and showed little sympathy for Cleary's state of mind at the time. All the time, talk still persisted and was rapidly seized by the press. All this rumour had no effect on Michael Cleary's ultimate sentence. He received 20 years penal servitude for the manslaughter of his wife. Jack Dunn and the Kennedy brothers were found guilty of wounding. Patrick Kennedy was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, Jack Dunn to 3, and the other two were sentenced to 1 year each. Patrick Boland and Michael Kennedy received a sentence of 6 months, but Mary Kennedy was set free by order of the court. There was some speculation that she had given information that helped convict the others, but this was far from certain. Early on, her daughter Joanna Burke revoked the first statement she had made to the police and turned Queen's evidence on the trial that she became chief witness for the prosecution, and evidence she provided was crucial. From the assize at Clonmel, the prisoners were taken to Mountjoy prison. Jack Dunn was later released on licence and returned to Ballyvadlea. His wife Kate died, and he himself is said to have finished his days as labouring man, broken and unwilling to talk about the incident. The Kennedys too were released on licence and returned home to work as labourers, refusing to say anything. Michael Cleary, however, remained in prison, being shunted away between Mountjoy in Dublin and Maryborough, now Portlaoise prison in County Laois. According to some accounts, he learned to work as a tailor and was rather quiet and withdrawn inmate. He was released on licence from Maryborough in 28th of April 1910. It is unclear whether he returned briefly to County Tipperary. Some argue he never returned, as he couldn't show his face in the countryside. But it is known that in June of the same year he boarded a ship bound via Liverpool to Montreal and vanished from the pages of recorded history. It is possible that when he arrived in Canada he changed his name and disappeared. The horrors of the Clonmel winch burning still lie somewhere deep in the memories of the people who live in Ballyvadlea today, and there are few in the countryside who are willing to talk about it. The area remains very close-knit, and the descendants of the main participants in the case are still living there. The community understandably wishes to consign the whole affair to history. Some vestiges of the Cleary house remain, although the original house itself has long been converted to another dwelling, and as such is not accessible to the public. Kindergry Hill is still there, of course, and much of the fort has once dominated its crown is still cleared away. It's still a sinister reputation, and all people in the area tell you privately that the fairies still hold court there certain nights of the year. Despite the passage of time, the recitings of local people, and the changes in the countryside, the case still holds fascination for the general public, and perhaps because it happened comparatively recently, and sporadic tours of the Tipperary witch country continue to be well subscribed, especially to visitors from overseas. Bridget Cleary seems ultimately being the victim of the eerie superstition that ebbed and flowed through the pleasant Tipperary countryside like a black tide. The local school children still sit an odd and slightly sinister rhyme as they play the skipping games. Are you a witch or are you a fairy? Are you the wife of Michael Cleary? Gormacut.